All right, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and get started. So thank you guys for coming. This is where I left off on Tuesday to give you your quiz. So we had gotten to the point where we're specifically talking about gated channels. And remember, we talked about leaky channels because that's how membrane potentials are established. And remember, they're always open. Okay. Directionality and flow through it is determined by the number of those channels and concentration differences across the membrane. I want to focus now on the gated channels. Now, again, just to remind you, it all depends on what stimulates them to open or close. There are three kinds that we have in physiology. We have voltage gated channels, which means some voltage disruption across the membrane. We have chemical gated channels, which means that there is a signaling molecule that binds to a receptor that then initiates opening and closing. And then there is a mechanical gated. That means, for instance, if deformation of that protein will result in opening or closing. Okay, so let's continue. So relevant for our current discussion in terms of electrical communication within a neuron. So up top, this is membrane potential. We've already talked about this. Remember, you have more potassium on the inside, more sodium on the outside. You have relatively the same concentration gradient for each of those. But in terms of the leaky channels, you got 50 to 85 more for potassium than sodium. So if we let everything interact, that means that potassium dictates membrane potential at minus 70 millivolts. All right. Now, that is a function of these leaky channels. Remember that the sodium potassium pump plays only a minor role in establishing this membrane potential, but its role is to maintain the relative concentration gradients for each of these molecules. So it pumps the potassium back into the cell and the sodium back out of the cell to maintain their respective gradients, right? This is we've already talked about. What I want to talk about now I want to focus on those gated channels, right? And how they play a role in developing a nerve impulse, an electrical impulse, all right? So basically, these are showing examples of two kinds, and they're just showing you a cartoon rendition of what they would look like. So the first one is, in this case, is a chemical gated channel. So we have our transport protein. It has a receptor modality on the surface. Signaling molecules, i.e. a neurotransmitter, binds to that receptor, and as long as it's binding that receptor, it's open. Okay, how does it close? We get rid of that signaling modality. We'll talk about how that happens later. In the case of voltage-gated channels, remember you have pluses on the outside, minuses on the inside. When there's a disruption of this, then we will then activate and open these, hence voltage-gated channels. Now, with this introduction, remember, I told you there were two types of electrical signaling. We have active potentials and graded potentials. Remember, graded potentials are short distance, active potentials are long distance. So what I want to do now is I want to focus on active potentials. I want to tell you, why are they the long distance? What enables them to be the long distance communicator in the body? What's unique about them? How are they enabled? So that's what I want to focus on now. So we'll spend a considerable amount of time, probably the bulk of the day, talking about action potentials because they're very unique. All right. Now, you can only have action potentials because you have two voltage-gated channels that play a role. One's for potassium and one's for sodium, right? So without these voltage-gated channels, can't have it. Now remember, a voltage-gated channel just simply means it doesn't require a signaling molecule binding to a receptor. It's just a local charge propagation across the membrane. That's how you activate them, right? Now, so basically what happens is, what I mean by charge change, remember we have membrane potential of minus 70. So if I start to stimulate that cell, I start to put in an electrical signal to stimulate that cell. Let's say that it's going to result in a depolarization. What does that mean? That means I'm going from minus 70 towards 0. Now, there is a level at which we have to put enough energy in there to initiate opening of these voltage gated channels. There has to be enough voltage change in order for this to happen. All right. So the first thing so basically there's voltage gated channels for sodium. They are activated at, say, at what is called a threshold potential. Let's say this is minus 55. So when we get a depolarization up to about minus 55, that's enough change to result in opening of those voltage gated channels. Once they're open, they stay open until, and what happens? They're open, so now what happens? We know that there's much, much more sodium outside, so it's going to flow in the cell. That's going to really induce a rapid depolarization. It goes to 0, it goes past 0, and it goes to plus 30 millivolts. At this point, the voltage-gated channels for sodium close. Right? At this point, at 30 millivolts, the potassium channels, the gated channel, these voltage-gated channels open. Potassium flows out of the cell, down its concentration gradient. There's a rapid repolarization, which results in going from plus 30 all the way down past 0, all the way past minus 70, because those voltage-gated channels for potassium do not close till around minus 80 millivolts. They close. Both voltage-gated channels are closed, and now membrane potential reestablishes itself due to these leaky channels, which are always open. So there's a rapid repolarization from minus 8 because we've had a hyperpolarization. It went below minus 70. Now it goes back up to minus 70. All right. Now we're ready to initiate another action potential. All right. So I want to compare. I'm just describing what's happening, but let's think of it in terms of permeability to how these enable the permeability. Now, remember, I'm not going to talk about up here the resting potential. We've already discussed that. You know this, all right? So that's minus 70. And that's all due, let's just focus on those leaky channels for sodium and potassium. So you know all of that. But I want to focus on the permeability changes, okay? So due to those leaky channels, sodium has a permeability normalized to 1. Potassium has a permeability normalized for sodium, but it's 50 to 75 times 1 for that of sodium. So that's how it dictates the formation of the membrane potential. Now, let's initiate an action potential. There is a local depolarization event at these voltage-gated channels for sodium. We reach threshold. When we reach this threshold, that means they open. This means that these are not the leaky channels. These are their own types of gated channels. They open. This greatly enhances the permeability for sodium. 600 times that of a resting membrane potential for sodium. 600 times. So that's the reason why it goes from minus 70, threshold potential, say minus 55, all the way up to plus 30. They close at plus 30. That means no more. The only way sodium is going to get into the cell is via the leaky channels, which are always open, right? Now, at plus 30, not only do the sodium voltage-gated channels close, the potassium voltage-gated channels open. Now, remember, they have more potassium on the inside than out, so it's going to flow out of the cell down its concentration gradient. But remember, you're already losing 50 to 75 times potassium ions for every sodium it gains. But now with the opening of these voltage-gated channels for potassium, there is a 300-fold additional increase, or total increase over sodium. So that means that potassium is flowing out of the cell. And we're losing these positive charges. That means that the potential across that membrane goes from plus 30 down to minus 80. This hyperpolarization is due to that the voltage-gated channels for potassium don't close until this point. Once both voltage-gated channels are closed, we're dependent upon the leaky channels to reestablish membrane potential. Right? Now, let me emphasize here that if you remember back to earlier discussions, what's happening across all of this is happening just across the membrane. So we're talking about positive ions lined here, have negative charges here, all right? Then, of course, what happens is when we open up, we have an influx of sodium ions, right? This is beyond the leaky channels. And then when that closes, no more comes in. They're only dependent upon the leaky channels and vice versa for potassium going the other way. The exchange of charges are just across the membrane surface. They're not out here in the interstitial space. They're not deep down here in the cytoplasm. They're only across the plasma membrane. That's why they can relatively readjust. Now, if you have, we'll talk about a single action potential is not going to result in a disproportionate distribution of sodium potassium. Repeated action potentials, sure. And this is another role for the sodium potassium pump. It's not required to establish a membrane potential particularly. It is meant to maintain the concentration gradients. So if we have lots and lots of movement of lots of action potentials, and that means over time we're going to have a disproportionate loss of potassium and disproportionate gain of sodium, and we have to use the sodium potassium pump. Again, its job is to maintain these concentration differences. So as we start to accumulate too much sodium inside the cell and potassium inside the cell due to repeated action potentials, the sodium potassium pump returns everything to normal in terms of the concentration gradients, right? Now, this is what an action potential looks like, right? So we can actually measure it. There's membrane potential on that y-axis, and time is on the x-axis, all right? So let me walk you through it because this is critically important that you understand what is an action potential before we can talk about gradient potential, right? Now, here is your membrane potential. Remember, it's at minus 70. Unstimulated, it's minus 70. There is a threshold potential which must be achieved in order to initiate opening of those sodium gates, voltage gates. Okay? And this particular example is minus 55. When I have a depolarization from minus 70 to minus 55, the voltage gated channels for sodium open. Sodium flows into the cell down its concentration gradient, resulting in an increase up to plus 30. So we have a loss of polarization, or we have a reversal of polarization. There's now more on the inside than the outside, right? So it goes all the way to plus 30. The voltage-gated channels for sodium close at this point. The voltage-gated channels for potassium open. Potassium now flows out of the cell, and that drops this back down to minus 80-ish, because this is where the voltage-gated channels for potassium close. And due to leaky channels, because remember, both voltage-gated channels are closed, due to the leaky channels, they return back up to minus 70 very rapidly. Okay, that's with a single action potential. Okay, so looking at this, let me walk you through it a little bit more. There are things which we call the absolute refractory period and the relative refractory period. Now, when these voltage gates for sodium are open, that means everything is committed on that cell for the movement of sodium because the gates are open. I can't change anything. Active action potential, this part here going to plus 30, right? Now, The only reason we can have an action potential is because there's membrane potential, right? So what happens? It's down here at -70, so we have this charge differential across the membrane. At this point, it's plus up here. We cannot have the flow return until we reestablish some aspect of that membrane potential. Okay? That's the reason why potassium voltage gate's open, because that's to drive the potential back down toward -70. Right? So absolute refractory period is once I've initiated this, these voltage gated channels stay open until we get to plus 30 millivolts. It doesn't matter how much more stimulation I provide, we already have all of those voltage gated channels open. I can't do any more. I'm already committed, and I can't stop until I get to plus 30. At that point, I can't initiate things either because I'm at plus 30. I'm not at -7-ish millivolts. All right. So there we have to drop down below 0, and we have to get somewhere down toward -70. So this area here is the absolute refractory period. Once I'm committed, I can't change anything. Relative refractory period is, well, I don't necessarily have to get back up to -70, but I have to have enough negative so that I can initiate another one, another action potential. Okay, I know this is confusing. This is a critical concept. For many years of teaching this, I know this is, I like to use analogies because I think they help. Okay, so the analogy I like to use for an action potential is one that everybody uses multiple times a day: a flush toilet. Yes, a flush toilet. Everybody knows what they are. You use them every day. All right. So in this particular instance, a classic seat flush toilet with a tank on the back. All right. How do you use it? You touch that little toggle on the side, or it's on the top, but let's say it's on the side. How does it work? Have you ever looked into a toilet? No. Okay. So take the lid off. All right. That switch is connected via a mechanical arm. There's an arm coming here. There's a chain coming down that's attached to a flapper at the bottom of the tank. Water's filling the tank. All right. There's a hole underneath that flapper that proceeds to that when water flows in, it will initiate a flush in the bowl. Okay. And everything that's in the bowl gets flushed down to the sewer. All right. So as you put enough pressure on this lever, that then mechanically it goes down here to the lever, it picks up the flapper. That means water can flow down its concentration gradient, and we initiate a flush. Right? So if you have one of those types of toilets, play with that tonight. So you go there and you flip on here. If you have to have a threshold force in order to lift that flapper. If you just flap it like this a little bit, it doesn't significantly pick up the flapper, you can't initiate a flush. Now you put enough force so that you lift the flapper and you've started a flush. Now, I don't care how hard you hit that toggle, you're not going to affect that flush. It's already committed 100%. All right? Until the water flows out of the tank, the flapper goes down, you still can't initiate another flush because you have to recharge or reset the system by somehow putting more water back into the tank. So if you let just a little bit of water get back in the tank and you open it up, you don't have enough water to initiate a flush. All right. So this is everything up to here is the absolute refractory period because we need to reset the system. Right now, that's absolute refractory period. Relative refractory period is, oh, I don't have to wait for that tank to completely refill. So if you go there, probably, depending on the tank, most of the tanks today are designed for like 0.68, 1.6 gallons in their tank. But you don't have to fill all of that up. You will fill some aspect, usually about half of it plus. All right. But once you get it, then you get it back about halfway full, then you can initiate another flush. That's the relative refractory period. Okay, so that's how I want you to understand absolute refractory period and relative refractory period. Now, right now, I'm just introducing what they do. I will talk about their significance in a little bit. Okay, so this is an action potential. It has both absolute and relative refractory periods. These play critical roles. The thing to understand is during an absolute refractory period, I cannot initiate another action potential. Here's the next thing. Because of these absolute refractory period, action potentials are individual wavelets. This is a wave, right? And you have to always have a wavelet. Action potentials, by definition, because of what I just talked about, they're always a wavelet. Okay? Always. And since they are wavelets, I can't sum them. I can't pile one on the other because I'm already committed. All right? I will come back to that in a little bit. All right? This is looking at an action potential in regards to relative permeability to sodium potassium. All right? I do expect you to understand what is an action potential, what is the role, when do the voltage gates for sodium open and potassium close, etc. I want you to understand how it is derived, how it comes from, what is the absolute, what is the relative refractory periods, because understanding that is critical toward understanding how it functions. All right, this is more of the same. I'm not going to go over that again, but here's what I want to show. Okay, action potentials their role is conductivity. Remember, a neuron has information coming in, it has conductivity along the length, and it has secretory activity going out. What action potentials play, their role they play is conduction. Right? So imagine we have a sensory neuron, an afferent neuron. It begins here and ends here. It's this long. It's a big, long tube. On the surface of that tube, we have voltage-gated channels. All right? Let's keep it simple just for the discussion. We have both sodium and potassium, but let's just focus on the sodium voltage-gated channels, just for the sake of this discussion. So imagine this tube structure, and we have these voltage-gated channels lining all the way down the structure. Now remember, these are voltage-gated channels. How do you activate them? A local disruption of the charge across the membrane. So they can only be activated by their immediate neighbor. So they act basically as a relay, neighboring voltage-gated channels. So if I disrupt this one, it will in turn disrupt its neighbor. Then it will disrupt its neighbor, and this means that we will then have this proceeding action potential down the length of this axon. All right? Now, absolute refractory period, as it's applied to this, ensures unidirectionality. What are two things that will determine the direction? Remember when I talked about the anatomy? The axon hillock is where you will initiate an action potential. So it has a specific point of beginning. Once you begin it, and it only occurs down the length of the axon because that's where the voltage-gated channels are, and it gets to the end, that's it. So the directionality is from the soma to the end of the axon. What ensures that it can't go back on itself is the absolute refractory period. So here is this, we have these neighbored voltage-gated channels. This one is activated. It's open. It activates this one, right? Then that activates this one. It can't go back this way because this is still working. So it's still committed. It has to reset. By the time it resets, this action potential is all the way down here, right? So you're thinking about, so this is basically what this is showing. We're seeing this action potential just proceeding down the entire length of this axon because each when the one voltage gate opens, it initiates the opening of its immediate neighbor. Okay. Now, if we have this long axon in nature, it has a beginning because we initiated here at the axon hillock. It goes in this direction. Always. However, experimentally, I can put an electrode anywhere I want along the length of that axon. So if I put an electrode and I stimulated the axon hillock, it goes from here to the end. However, if I take that electrode and put it in the middle, what's going to happen? Exactly. So it has a point, but there's nothing limiting it from going in either direction. So it's going to go this way. If I was to put an electrode here and fire them, they would go this way, they would cancel out, they would go this way to their respective ends. But in nature, it always begins at the axon hillock. So it's always from the soma side to the axon terminal side, because that's what it's designed to do. All right? Conductivity. Now, next, if you remember, an action potential goes to plus 30. It can never go past plus 30. Never! Because that's when the voltage gated channel for sodium closed and potassium open. So it has a fixed magnitude of plus 30 millivolts. Remember that. Right? So, wait a minute. This is a sensing neuron. That means it's telling, so how can I discriminate in signal strength when I'm pressing a little bit or hard? How does that work? So, magnitude is fixed. So I can't have a change in magnitude of an action potential. The only thing I can control is the frequency of those action potentials per unit time. Right? So, if I have minimal stimulation, which does not achieve threshold potential, what happens? No action potentials fire because the voltage gated channel for sodium do not open. Now, I will signal them a little bit. So let me use this. Well, let me walk through here because it's easier. All right, here's threshold. I've never reached threshold, so that means I do not get an action potential. Now, I'm going to hook up this neuron to stimulation, electrostimulation. I'm going to put enough stimulation that gives me, say, minus 50 millivolts. Since I pass threshold, that's going to initiate an action potential. It's fixed. It goes up to 30. It comes back. It recharges, but it can't go below minus 60 because minus 50 because that's where I'm stimulating it. And once it gets down here, so this is the absolute refractory period. It comes down here. It doesn't drop all the way down to minus 70 because it's in the relative refractory period, and I can initiate a second wavelet, and that comes up, comes down, comes up, comes down. So with this level of stimulation, I can stimulate 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 action potentials. Right? So let's increase stimulation. That means I'm getting closer to 0. So now instead of minus 50, it's minus 45 or minus 40. So same thing is happening. It's going to get to here, it's going to go up. It's not going to come all the way back down. And I can get more action potentials per same unit time. Right? Now, let's stimulate it some more. So what that means, I'm going to even get more action potentials. However, there is a ceiling because, number one, remember, action potentials are individual wavelets by definition because of this absolute refractory period. That means I can never reach 0. I can approach 0, but I can't get close to 0 because I have to have the charge difference across the membrane in order for this to happen. All right? So that means that the way that your nervous system works in judging signal strength or stimulation strength is by frequency of action potentials. That means as I increase the frequency of action potentials passing down the length of the neuron, when they get to the end, they're going to induce the release of chemical agents. Okay. So each time one of those action potentials gets to the end, there'll be another signal. So if I'm doing it 5 times, that means 5 times release. If I'm doing it 10 times release in the same time frame. So that is how action potential, though they have a fixed magnitude, they still are capable of providing signal strength due to the frequency per unit time. All right. Now, we have, yes.
Is it true that the stimulus or the action potentials act in a negative feedback way, as far as the longer you keep the stimulus, the less frequent the action potential will occur? Like they become sort of immune to the stimulus in a sense?
Not in the direct functionality of the action potentials here, but there is something else that's down. We'll talk about that later. Right now, I just want to focus on this. That's more complicated than this. That involves more than this. That a desynthesization is what you're talking about. That doesn't have to do with this, correct? Okay. Now, remember, let's go back here to this tube. We have this neuron that goes from here, goes all the way up here. It's lined with these voltage gated channels. It works as a relay. You've done relays when you were kids, right? Right? So that means you don't run the whole race yourself, you pass it off to somebody. This is exactly what happens here. So the thing about it is we have this long tube, and here's the point where we begin. We activate this voltage gated channel, it activates its immediate neighbor. Its immediate neighbor, its immediate neighbor, its immediate neighbor. That means basically that there is a fixed rate at which those action potentials can proceed down the length of that axon, because they are dependent upon going from immediate neighbor to immediate neighbor. Everybody with me so far? But wait a minute, if I'm going from here to here, that could take a long time. I mean, I've stuck my finger in. I'm cooking dinner, and I put my finger. I had put my finger down on the burning on the heated element of my stove. I mean, I don't want to wait for 5 minutes for the signal to get from here to here. I'll have cooked finger. It's much quicker, right? So, but wait a minute, going from here to here can take a long time. How can I speed it up? This means that we have to have one of the glial cells involved. We're in the peripheral nervous system, and we're talking about an axon. And when I gave you the general anatomy of it, I included what we call the Schwann cells. Now, I said the Schwann cells act as insulators. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about how that works, because it's critical, because it is not only do we need to conduct a signal across this long distance, we need to do it very quickly, beyond the limitations of neighbor to neighbor exchange, right? And that's because these Schwann cells act as an insulator. Now, how does that work? So I always forget to do this. You know, everyone knows what a baggie is, right? A Ziploc bag. Take a Ziploc bag, a quart Ziploc bag. I don't care, a gallon Ziploc bag. Doesn't matter. Take a quart, put a boiled egg in it, and about a cup of water. That's a Schwann cell. Right? Now take a pencil and take up here where the Ziploc part is, and it has a little bit of water, and there's egg at the bottom. The egg is basically the nucleus. The water is the cytoplasm. Right? Now, take that. You have a pencil here, or a chopstick, whatever you have. All right. Maybe it's the handle of a wooden spoon or whatever. All right. Hold this here, then start wrapping that around. So think about that Ziploc bag. The 2 layers are basically the plasma membrane of the cell, of the Schwann cell. As it's wrapping, the water and the egg are excluded. So basically, you have several wrappings of the plastic part of the bag, and only at the outside and this, all the water and the egg are restricted to the outside of that bag. All right. Notice you have the multiple wrappings you see here. Here's the boiled egg and here's the water. Right? And here's the axon. What are those wrappings made of in the cell? Plasma membrane. So basically, there's multiple wrappings of the plasma membrane around this axon. All right. And so basically, we call these wrappings parts, we call that the myelin sheath. The excluded parts, which contains the bulk of the cytoplasm and the nucleus, is called the neurolema. All of these are part of the Schwann cell. Where they're at, would be voltage-gated channels and there's voltage-gated channels all the way along the length of this axon. But the ones under here can't work. There cannot be any exchange because they're covered. That's the insulation part. Now, how does that work? Right? So, there's two things that are going to determine the rate at which you can have action potentials go along the length of an axon. Two things. Number one, remember, we're talking surface exchange. So, the bigger the cell, the more surface area, the faster things can move. The bigger the neuron, faster things can move. Now, we throw in Schwann cells, we throw in myelin sheath, that we can also further increase the speed. So, small unmyelinated neurons have a speed of 0.5 to 2 meters per second. Pretty slow. In physiological terms, that's slow. Right? Small myelinated fibers, just by myelinization, we can increase from 0.5 to 2 to 3 to 15 meters per second. Now, we want to go from here to here. So these are large and myelinated, which we can approach speeds of up to 120 meters per second. All right. And that's due to the combination of size, surface area, which means more voltage-gated channels, and myelinization. All right. Now, I haven't really introduced this concept, but there's a couple of concepts. There's one that is critical for all aspects of physiology. There ain't no such thing as a free dinner. What do I mean? That means that if you want to change something, you have to take it away from something else. All right? Everything comes with a cost. Now, so in order to have a bigger cell and it's myelinated with all these little cells, that requires a huge amount of resources and energy. This is the reason why you don't have all large neurons with myelinization. You only have them where you need them. Okay? So, if you are only communicating across a very short distance like this versus this, you don't need a large neuron. You don't need myelinization. And because life is expensive, resources are rare and expensive, your anatomy will be based on that. All right? So that's why you have a variety of neuron types in terms of size and myelinization and relation to speed. Right? Now, let's talk about how myelinization works. So remember, if we have a naked axon, we have all these voltage-gated channels. So the action potential goes pop, 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 pop. It can't jump. It has to go from one immediate neighbor to the next immediate neighbor. So it takes a finite amount of time to go from here to here, right? Myelinization means that part of that axon is covered. Where it's covered, you can't have the voltage-gated exchange, okay? So here's myelinization here. Here is a naked exposed axon. This is referred to as a node of Rodvier. This is your myelin sheath here. So basically what happens is you can only have exchange from the extracellular environment to the cytoplasm only here at the node of Ranvier. It cannot happen here because it's covered, right? Now, this is where we talk about diffusional transport, right? Diffusion transport works really, really well in small length scales. Really, really well. And these nodes of Ranvier are very small. So basically, as well as the Schwann. So what happens is this. We have the influx of sodium molecules in, down their concentration gradient. And obviously, because the direct, I'm this artificially inducing it here, it's going to go this way, going to go that way. But once it gets under here, you can't have the relay. So it has, the sodium has to diffuse until it gets over here, and it will then reinitiate the voltage-gated channels. Then it goes here and so on. So what that does is, in these small length scales, that allows you to increase the rate at which you're moving along that axon. All right. Now, let's see. And that's basically what this is showing here. So think about it. So myelinization means I'm increasing signal transport speed. Is there a limit? Is there a limit of myelinization? That's our question. Now, we're going to answer that question with a group presentation, if you will. Right? Yes. So I have volunteers. The first two rows, all of you, thank you for volunteering. Will you come stand up here in front here? I'll line up in front, side by side. Okay? Yep. It's a move to where you're all lined up. Move all in front. Okay. Yep. All right. Space yourselves equally. Okay. Now, can I get someone to be my timekeeper? Anybody? Don't care. Come on. All of you got phones. I guarantee it. All right. You volunteered for my time. Okay. Drew, you're my axon hillock. You are my secretory. That's my terminal button. Okay, so this is the beginning of the axon, end of the axon, right? You guys are fixed. You cannot move, right? Each of you represent voltage-gated channels, right? So if I initiate over, if I start over here, Drew passes to immediate neighbor, immediate neighbor, immediate neighbor, immediate neighbor, and so on. So this represents, so there's no myelinization. This is just your standard axon with all your voltage-gated channels, right? So I'm going to stimulate the axon hillock. Okay, usually I like timer ready. When I pass it to you, you pass it to your immediate neighbor. You cannot throw it to the other end. You have to pass it only to your immediate neighbor, and you have to hand it to them physically. Okay? Ready? Ready, timer? Begin. Fast as you can without dropping. Stop. Time. 12 seconds. Okay? That's an unmyelinated axon. Starting with you, alternate people sit down. So every second person sits down. No one moves other than those. You sit down. No, you're done. You're done. You're done. Yes, done. Done. Yes. You two do not move. Okay. All right. Alternate people have done. Now, each gap represents a Schwann cell, part of the myelin sheath. Right? I have not changed the length of the axon. It's still fixed. I've just hidden this part. Okay. Now, this means in order to technically what's happening, it's diffusing from here to here, but this is just to illustrate time. All right, so I'm going to start. Ready? Begin. Don't, yeah. Fast, but don't drop. Stop. What was the time? All right. So we halved our speed of transport from one end to the other. So it hadn't changed the length, it's not changed. All right. Now, here's the kicker. I asked the question before we started this process. I asked, can you have too much myelinization? Remembering that diffusion only works for small length scales. Right? So, now what I want to do is, you sit down and alternate people sit down. Okay? Now, the three people in the middle kind of equilibrate their distance. It's not perfect, but, kind of make sure that you're equal apart. Yeah, that sounds good. Okay. All right. So I've just increased the amount of myelinization along the length of that axon. Right? Now we're ready. Again, Drew, you're not going to get you cannot give up a movement. You have to physically hand it off. Ready? Begin. Okay. Right? Not going anywhere. All right, sit it. Oh, yes. Thank you. So I like to use this to demonstrate, yes, myelinization is critical for increasing speed, but you will never have a completely myelinated nerve. Because diffusion to go from here to here, due to the myelinization, that's 150 meters per second. If there was no myelinization, it would probably take upwards of, how many of you have done diffusion experiments? It's going to take approximately 2 days to get from here to here. Okay? You'd be dead by that point, right? So it works, but there has to be regularity. You have to have these nodes of rendezvous in order to maintain the speed, right? If you have too much, it doesn't work, right? Now, that gets us to pathologies associated with the myelin sheath. I can disrupt, not me, but there are certain diseases which disrupt communication by disrupting the myelin sheath. One classic example is called multiple sclerosis or MS. So this primarily involves not so much the peripheral nervous system, but the central nervous system. Remember, oligodendrocytes perform the same function as Schwann cells. It's just that they're in the central nervous system. So what actually happens is MS is basically an autoimmune disease. That means your immune system starts to kind of attack itself. And you get these inflammations and you get basically scarring and so forth. No one's born with MS. It just starts usually sometime back in your 20s, 30s, or something like that. And basically, the symptoms are, as it advances, it disrupts signal transport time, all right? And makes things slower or so forth. And basically what happens is, since it's primarily associated with the central nervous system, that means you can't communicate in or out very effectively. Now, classically, what that does is it can result in, a lack of controlled movement. You get tremors and so forth. And I talked with some experience, a really good friend, an ex-student of mine I've known for 40 years. I remember him as an undergrad and a graduate and a technician. And his 20s and early 30s, MS didn't happen until he was in probably 40, 45. Okay. I've watched him over the decades go from, this guy that's just running around, and he's now in a wheelchair. And the deal is that MS currently does not have a cure. Now, what you can do is what you're basically doing, like with a lot of these chronic diseases, is you want to control the inflammation, the autoimmune response. You want to limit that. Greg happens to be one of the 0.15% of the population that doesn't respond to any of the current therapies. Okay, so therapies can be everything from anti-inflammatory agents. Ultimately, you get down to stem cell transplantation. And that's what's being currently utilized now. It has no cure. And it's just you go to the point, and then after, then if it gets to the point where it's going to impact critical organ function, and then you succumb. All right. So MS. And it all has to do with what's happening is you get a scarring along the length, so that disrupts communication. So that's essentially like covering the whole length of the axon. All right. Now, those are action potentials. So let me give you a brief review before we start on gradient potentials. Action potentials, when I initiate them, they always go to plus 30. So action potentials are actually all or none. When I initiate them, it always goes to plus 30. They're all or none. Number two, they are individual wavelets because they have to go to plus 30 and then come back down. They are always wavelets. If you looked at that frequency, I can increase the frequency, but I still have to have individual individual action potentials. All right. They exhibit, there is a threshold potential that initiates them. Once they all go to the same amplitude. They also exhibit absolute refractory period and relative refractory period. Those are action potentials. The job of action potentials is long distance communication, i.e. conductivity. They are enabled because of voltage gated channels for both sodium and potassium. And anatomically, they are located exclusively on the axon. They begin at the axon hillock and they end at the terminus of the axon, right? So they only occur there, and their job is conduction. Now, let's focus on the next version, which are graded potentials, right? First, graded potentials, as I've already mentioned, are short distance communicators. They're designed for short distance communication. Their role, as opposed to action potentials, is not conductivity. Their role is to bring a signal into the cell, excitability. They are responsible for the excitability of the neuron, right? So they are bringing information into the cell. Then, if that signal strength is sufficient, they will then result in an activation of an action potential, which will then conduct the signal down to the next cell down. All right. So what are graded potentials? Right? They are different, completely different from action potentials. Now, when you look at them, so basically we have all our charges here lined up along this axon. And again, we are not talking, so basically they're here. And when we have a triggering event, whatever it may be, is happening here. That will result in a local displacement. And basically, that means that we will initiate this neighbor-to-neighbor activation, but we don't have all of these voltage-gated channels lined up neighbor-to-neighbor. So that means that we can't self-perpetuate that action potential on the length of that axon. That means it only has limited area at which it can be associated. That also means that when I stimulate it, the amount of stimulation will determine the range at which I can extend activation along the surface of that cell, right? Which is completely different from action potentials. So this means, because we don't have all these lined up relays, which we now have you now understand, hopefully, graded potentials don't have them. So they are not self-perpetuating. So that means that, number one, you have the highest magnitude or potential signal strength at the point at which you're initiating them. The more energy I put, the greater this is. And then, of course, it dissipates as it gets away from the point of stimulation. All right. So, what does that mean? So, again, I'm going to use an analogy. Right. Here's how I want you to think about it. You're up in the mountains. You come across, and you're hiking up in the mountains. It's the late summer day. It's still pretty warm. You're hot. You come across a mountain lake. Mountain lake is surrounded by higher ridges. There's no wind. The surface of this lake is like a mirror, right? Now you walk down to the beach, the bank of this, and the water is just laid beautiful. All right. Then you have the beach is comprised of some sand, some pebbles, and rocks. Okay. So you look at that mirror and you say, I want to disturb it. Okay. You've all done this. Have you skipped rocks on water or thrown rocks in water just to make it up? So this is what you're going to do. You're going to reach down. You're going to pick up a little pebble. Right? You're standing right on the bank. You pitch it in. It goes in about 2 meters, drops vertically in, and then what happens? It goes in the water. It's going to create a circular wavelet, right? And the wavelets are going to radiate from the source, and they're going to proceed outward, but they only go out this far. Okay? So little's good, bigger's going to be better. So you reach down, you pick up a larger rock. You throw it with the same trajectory. It lands in the water. It creates wavelets which are much higher. They radiate away from, and instead of going like a quarter of a meter, they go a meter in a circular pattern. You reach down, you pick up a fist-sized rock, throw it exactly the same trajectory, increase wavelets, they go to 1.5 meters. You say, this is enough. You reach down, you pick up a big honking rock you can barely pick up, throw it, it goes the same trajectory, it goes in, you got to step back because the wavelets are going to get your feet wet. All right? So that is how graded potentials work. The greater the source of energy going in there to create them means that you're going to create a larger membrane potential difference, and it's going to be able to extend further from the point of which you generated it initially. All right? Graded potentials. These are completely different from action potentials. Now, another thing that's different between graded potentials and action potentials. In action potentials, when you open those gated channels, what happens? You always go toward. So when you initiate an action potential, it always goes towards zero. Always. Because the first thing to open are the voltage gated channels for sodium. So it can't go any other direction but towards zero. Graded potentials, on the other hand, can go to either towards zero or in the opposite direction. So they can either be depolarizing signals or hyperpolarizing signals. So they can either go towards zero, depolarization, or away from zero, hyperpolarization. Completely unique to graded potentials. Now, where do they occur? Anatomically, they occur because they are responsible for bringing information into the cell. Anatomically, they're going to be restricted to either the dendrites or the surface of the soma. Right? You don't have them along the axon. You do not have them at the terminal bud of the axon. You only have them on the soma and the dendrite surfaces. Right? So, how are they created? They're created by chemical gated channels across the synapse. All right. So remember when I talked about a synapse, we have a presynaptic membrane, postsynaptic membrane. The presynaptic membrane, neurotransmitters are released into the synaptic cleft. They diffuse across. They bind to receptors on the chemical gated channels on the postsynaptic membrane. As long as those neurotransmitters are bound, they're open. They result in creating graded potentials. Okay? So they are not created by voltage-gated channels. In this case, chemical-gated channels. Right? So that's how it works. So let's say I have a neurotransmitter. It is connected. It's part of a chemical gated channel for sodium. So as that neurotransmitter binds to the receptor, that receptor protein opens, what happens? Come on, what happens? You know. What happens to the potential? Does it go towards zero or does it go away from zero? Go towards zero. Why? Where? Get simple. Don't make it overcomplicated. Where is most of the sodium? Outside the cell. So when I open these channels, what happens? So that means you have all these positive ions going into the cell. So what's happening to the membrane potential? It goes towards zero. Depolarization. With me so far? All right. Having just had this discussion, what happens if that chemical gated channel was for potassium? What would happen if I initiate that chemical gated channel? What would happen to membrane potential?
Away from zero.
Away from zero. What do we call that? Hyperpolarization. Okay. So within the synapse, if we have a neurotransmitter that is going to be targeting sodium, it will lead us to a depolarizing event. If it is going for potassium, it will be a hyperpolarizing event. So hence, graded potentials can either go towards zero or away from zero. Okay? They can be either depolarizing or hyperpolarizing. Okay? Now, let's try to put some things together. You should now kind of realize graded potentials are initiated where? In the synapse. That means they are controlled by action potentials. We have our presynaptic and postsynaptic cells, right? In the presynaptic cell, we have a signal being conducted down the length of the axon. It gets to the terminal bud, where we have the synapse. It initiates the release of chemical signaling agents. So we convert an electrical to a chemical signal. It binds to these chemical gated channels. And when they open, they are going to initiate a graded potential. So that means that graded potentials are controlled by action potentials, right? Because remember, what are action potentials? They are meant to conduct an electrical signal across the length of the cell, the axon. Strictly conduction. Whereas gated potentials are designed to bring information into the cell. In this case, the postsynaptic cell, right? But they're controlled by action potentials. Every time an action potential gets to the end of an axon, there's going to be the release of neurotransmitter. But remember, action potentials have a fixed magnitude. So that means every time an action potential gets to the end of the axon, I will have the release of X amount of neurotransmitter. X amount. It's fixed. But wait a minute. I said, what about frequency? So this is how we start thinking about signal strength. So if it's X, what if I increase my frequency? If I double my frequency, that means it's going to be 2x within that time frame, 3x, 5x, whatever. Because every time an action potential gets to the end, it's going to release neurotransmitter, right? Now, the next thing to remember is this. We have exocytosis for the presynaptic membrane. We have the release of neurotransmitters, who are basically amino acid derived, most of them, essentially. Now we have, what happens is they are now in this synaptic cleft. They bind to the receptors. As long as they're there, there is open. They're open. These chemical gated channels are open. However, I haven't mentioned this yet, but also within that synaptic cleft are enzymes which are designed to rapidly destroy those neurotransmitters. So that means that I have an Ash potential resulting in the release of neurotransmitter. It binds to the receptor. We're having the sodium, say, flow in, but it stops immediately because of the enzymes that degrade the neurotransmitter very rapidly, and then they close again. So that means that effectively I can only have that chemical gated channel open for very short periods of time. And this makes sense, right? So that's where the frequency comes in. So it's released, but then gone, released and gone, released and gone. So if I want to maintain stimulation generating graded potentials, I have to increase my frequency, which allows me to replace that degraded part, because now I have it's released and gone, but now replace it, released, gone, replaced, released, gone, and so on. All right. So so this is critical for you to understand that within the synaptic cleft, there is rapid destruction of these neurotransmitters, which means that I have to constantly replace them. And that's where this increased frequency comes into play. Right? And then every time an Ash potential gets to the end and we have the binding, we will generate a graded potential. But that doesn't mean that a graded potential is enough in itself to initiate a firing of a Ash potential downstream. Right? We have to have enough signal strength. Because remember, these graded potentials can be both depolarizing as well as hyperpolarizing. So I want to talk in terms, so we're talking about frequency here, and there's also another aspect. So we can talk about, so what I'm getting to is we have summation of Ash potentials because they're discrete wavelets, but I can vary the frequency. All right. So we call this, in this particular case, we have, note up here, we have a single presynaptic neuron that is ending on the soma surface of this postsynaptic neuron. All right, a single synapse. So every time an Ash potential gets to the end, there will fire and release neurotransmitters, and that will provide a signal. All right, and in this case, note that, and I've excited that E1 cell, but when it fires, it generates a graded potential, but it's below threshold in terms of stimulating a subsequent action potential, which means there will be no action potential resulting because it's subthreshold. Now, let's increase the frequency of stimulation. So we're reducing the amount of time between adjacent action potentials. So if I reduce the time, what happens is this. So here's what's happening. I have the release of the neurotransmitter. It binds to the receptors. So we now are having an influx of sodium. So we're getting a depolarization event. But what's happening is that neurotransmitter is rapidly degraded by the enzymes. It's gone, and then that goes back toward -70. We stimulate another one, goes from -70 and then up to -53, but not quite enough, and goes back down. Now we increase the frequency, means that we fire this, but we don't let that degrade all the way before we get the next stimulation. So the enzymes have only had a chance to destroy some of that neurotransmitter. So now we can sum these two, they're close enough together. So this one drops down. We now see another one, and the total adds up beyond threshold, and we have an action potential. All right. So that's where frequency is coming into play. But we have to understand that the neurotransmitter, when it's released from a single action potential in the presynaptic membrane, once it's in the synaptic cleft, it has a fixed lifespan, and it ain't very long. And I have to keep repeating the release of more neurotransmitter by increasing the frequency of action potentials in order to continually to stimulate. And that is what we call temporal summation. Temporal summation. So I'm increasing the frequency of action potentials. Now, this is assuming a single excitatory neuron, axon, terminus. We also can talk about spatial summation. Spatial summation. And in that example, we can have two excitatory neurons. And let's say that they are actually branched from the same source axon. So that means that they're going to be stimulated at exactly the same time. They're going to release their neurotransmitter at exactly the same time. Right? So that means instead of 1x, I'm getting 2x because they are closely associated. So instead of terminal summation, I can get spatial summation. So I showed you that example where you had clumps of synapses on a terminus muscle cell. Each one of them will release the same amount of neurotransmitter. They may result in a sub threshold by themselves, but they're grouped together. They all add up because they're really close together. And now we get spatial summation, right? Temporal summation, spatial summation. This is physically impossible with action potentials because they're discrete wavelets. This only works for graded potentials, right? Now, also remember, we can have also, again, reminding you, we can also depolarizing and hyperpolarizing events. So we can have spatial summation. In this case, we have two excitatory, and these can either, you can make this what you want. E1 and E2 can be the same axon beginning. Maybe they're two different ones that are firing at the same time. So that's spatial summation. What happens if I have two different ones? This one is excitatory. This one is inhibitory. This results in a depolarizing signal. This also results in a hyperpolarizing signal. All right. If they're close together, they fire at comparable times. That means, again, what we do is always summation. But in this case, we're not talking a plus plus a plus. We're talking a plus plus a minus. And that means that even though say we have an excitatory one and it would come up to here, if there's overlap signaling from the inhibitory one, that drives it down because it's summed and it's plus and a minus, right? So under these circumstances, we can have an inhibitory. So we call these postsynaptic potentials, and we have two types of postsynaptic potentials. We can have them going towards zero, which is an excitatory postsynaptic potential, EPSP, and we can have them going away toward hyperpolarization. Those are inhibitory postsynaptic potentials, right? And these are only occurring with graded potentials, right? And I think, yeah. Let's see. And basically, this is just what I've been talking about here. Excitatory, inhibitory. I'm looking at the clock. Yes, I know we have seminar in about 15 minutes. I'm going to let us go a little early to make sure everybody has time to go since I have to go too. And we'll go ahead and stop here and we'll continue on Tuesday. All right, everybody.